Hello again and a warm welcome back. I hope this video finds you in good health. During the last chapter I would suggest a controversial theory that there might be a link between Silent Hill 2 protagonist James Sunderland and the former US President George W. Bush. I would show that the etymology of James's given name, literally meaning supplanter of a divided land, could potentially be an artistic metaphor for the debacle of the 2000 US presidential elections, in which George Bush had conspired to rig the elections and thus become the illegal occupant of the White House, presiding over a land divided by the electorate. A reminder here, of course, that this was the world's biggest news story during the development stage for Silent Hill 2. I would then highlight James's connections to Pyramid Head, in such that Pyramid Head is the dark side of James's conscience, perhaps a manifestation of all of his evil intent. During a previous chapter I had highlighted several seemingly deliberate connections between Pyramid Head and the Nazis, and from this I had argued that if Pyramid Head is both artistically representative of a Nazi butcher and the supposed dark side of James Sunderland, aka George W. Bush, then maybe we could also establish a link between the Bush political dynasty and the history of the Nazis. The links duly followed, of course, as I'd highlighted the profiteering that George Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, would make from the victims of the Holocaust. I suppose that many of you are still scoffing at this suggestion, so I'll double down in this chapter and show you how the sequel to Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 3, potentially highlights one of the most controversial aspects of George Bush's administration, his unrelenting attack on women's rights to body autonomy. Herein we're going to analyse the story of Silent Hill 3 and discuss the controversy of Heather's abortion and why the crazy church lady Claudia Wolfe might be representative of the church's influence on conservative American politics, particularly the Republican Party, aka the notorious GOP. We can also look at clues from early in the game that might lean into women's rights, a topic that was also the main driving force for the shocking story of 2025's popular video game Silent Hill F. Okay, let's go. So, for those of you who haven't played the game yet, I want to highlight that this chapter is obviously going to be full of story spoilers. The game is over 20 years old by this point, so if you haven't played it by now, I'm afraid that's your problem. Where though should we begin with analysing Heather's story? Should we start at the beginning of the game? No, that's far too obvious. Let's instead begin at the end, just before the final battle against God. Here we can see the game's protagonist Heather in the nave of a chapel confronting the game's main antagonist Claudia Wolfe, the leader of the town's secret religious cult. Despite Claudia's holier-than-thou appearance, we can see that she's just committed the ultimate sin of murder by stabbing fellow cult member Vincent, because they both have different opinions on what their version of God actually represents. During the ensuing cutscene, Heather laments on the fact that a god born of hatred cannot bring about an eternal paradise, before she falls into labour and collapses to the floor in agony. With Claudia gleefully anticipating the birth of her evil god, Heather miraculously recovers and takes a red pill out of her pendant necklace, a probable Matrix-inspired nod to the acceptance of growing up and realising the evils of the world, before swallowing said pill and once again collapsing to the ground. Heather now vomits out the oversized fetus, symbolically representative perhaps of having an abortion, and proceeds to watch in horror as Claudia decides to incubate the new demon god by grotesquely swallowing it whole. Jesus Christ. Soon afterwards, the crazy religious zealot then becomes sick and stumbles over towards the chancel, which just so happens to look like a cervix by the way, before she starts to bleed from her nether regions. The demon god then rips Claudia down through the hole to where the final boss battle will begin, leaving behind a scarred hole which is quite clearly here representative of a ruptured cervix, an artistic interpretation perhaps of an abortion. Whilst this revelation of Heather's pregnancy may come as a shock to some, it wouldn't if you'd been paying attention from the very beginning. There are in fact several references in the first area of the game that highlight Heather's thought process as she toys with the idea of an abortion. Let's look at them now. And so, back at the Central Square shopping centre, which we will consider here as the first level of the game, we can find a handful of clues to Heather's hidden pregnancy. I say hidden pregnancy here because I'm sure that we don't find out this information until much later into the game, if at all before the previously shown chapel scene. Admittedly, my memory is a little hazy on this detail. Regardless, back in the shopping centre, after the transition to the other world, we can head back to Marguerite's boutique, where we'd earlier collected the handgun and saw Heather kill off the giant monster. In the otherworld version of this store, we can now find a coat hanger resting upon the clothes rail. For those of you who are not in the know, the coat hanger is an international symbol of women's struggles for their rights to body autonomy and safe access to abortion practices. Historically, those women who have been prevented from this have resorted to more crude methods to end their pregnancies. I'm sure you can fill in the blanks here. If you're not so sure about this, I want to now show you how and where we will come to use this instrument. Let's head over to the otherworld version of the Happy Burger restaurant, where we can see that the tables have been conveniently rearranged to allow Heather to climb up to the crevasse above. There are two things to note here. Firstly, I think this is the table where Heather was sat during the game's intro. We can see here that Heather is questioning the reality of her situation. Is she still asleep and just dreaming all of this, much like James's delusion in Silent Hill 2? We'll come back to discuss this another time, but for now I want you to note that Heather also doubles down on driving home this point of dreaming during the elevator descent that triggers the transition between the fog world and the nightmarish otherworld. And secondly, back in the Happy Burger restaurant, we can now climb upon the table and use the coat hanger. Notice here how the camera angle has changed to show us looking down upon Heather, as if we're looking down on her from the proverbial womb. Heather proceeds to thrust the coat hanger into the crevasse and pulls down a ladder for us to continue onwards in our quest. If this isn't an artistic interpretation of an abortion, I don't know what is. Shortly thereafter, we come across this door that leads to the first boss battle of the game, the symbolically phallic splitworm monster. Again, I don't think you need to read between the lines to see the pregnancy symbolism here. Anyways, back at the locked door, we can see that it's engraved with a message. Piling up the 300th day and night, from beyond the door cries of pain are heard, and the final destination has become real, though not a blessed beginning. It is worth mentioning here that 300 days is accepted by medical professionals as the maximum term of pregnancy. Most pregnancies will top out around 280 days, but anything exceeding 290 days will likely see an induced birth from the said doctors, for safety reasons of course. To access the splitworm monster, we must place the moonstone into the indentation in the door. To get access to the moonstone, we need to use the finger-breaking torture device on the walnut, which may in an allegorical way also be a kind of birthing metaphor. Talking of moonstones, these gemstones are often associated with pregnancy because they symbolise new beginnings and femininity, likely one would imagine here because of the symbolic link between the monthly cycle of the moon and the monthly menstrual cycle. Anyways, there's a few in-game references to get you started, but where did the game's artists get the idea from to discuss this sensitive topical issue in the first place? Well, have I got news for you. You will likely recall from a previous video that I'd made the crazy suggestion that James Sunderland from Silent Hill 2 may have been named so as a descriptive metaphor for the conspiracy surrounding the results of the 2000 US presidential elections, and how the bad side of his conscience, Pyramid Head, the metaphorical Nazi butcher, was possibly an exploration of George Bush's historical ties to the Nazis. Do you also recall that I'd noted that this was the world's biggest news story during the game's development stage, and how I felt this had influenced the game's writers and artists? Well, I hate to say this here, but the Bushisms aren't going away. During the development stage for Silent Hill 3, which likely started in the autumn of 2001 and the winter of 2002, US President George W. Bush was hard at work restricting women's reproductive rights. This shouldn't come as a surprise, of course. The suppression of women's rights has long been a policy of the Republican Party and American conservatives. Heck, Margaret Atwood even wrote a best-selling novel about it back in the middle of America's Reagan-era Christofascist dystopia. In fact, it was the more extreme religious elements of the Christian far right that would skew the Republican Party throughout the 1980s and 1990s towards the oppressive idiocracy that we see before us today. This isn't a broad criticism of Christianity before any of you get upset. I am, of course, rightfully respectful when upon sacred grounds and have seen firsthand the wonderful things that the Church can do for local communities. However, we all know too well how this so-called faith can also be weaponised for political gain and to restrict the rights of vulnerable members of society. Former President Bush would do just this as he signed into law the Partial Birth Abortion Act of 2003, which had restricted women's rights to access safe abortion practices during the second trimester of pregnancy. This was the culmination of 2 years of anti-abortion rhetoric and practice and was once again an ongoing story around the world during the development stage of Silent Hill 3. There's some food for thought, huh? Okay, that's it for this video. Next up we're heading back to Silent Hill 2 to discuss possible references to Native American genocide and the history of slavery and civil rights issues in America. But before we go, I want to leave you with a quick video as recompense for my justified bashing of former President Bush. My reasoning for this is to show you, despite the irrevocable harm that he caused to many American women and millions more Iraqis and Afghans, that there was a human being inside that occasionally broke through. How did we get from this to the vitriol of Donald Trump, the new king of memes? Anyways, I'll leave you with this rather uplifting video, and I'll see all of you again real soon. As they say in Clandau, ciao for now.
Good morning. Last night, I had a warm conversation with President-elect Barack Obama. I congratulated him and Senator Biden on their impressive victory. I told the President-elect he can count on complete cooperation from my administration as he makes the transition to the White House. I also spoke to Senator John McCain. I congratulated him on a determined campaign that he and Governor Palin ran. The American people will always be grateful for the lifetime of service John McCain has devoted to this nation. And I know he'll continue to make tremendous contributions to our country. No matter how they cast their ballots, all Americans can be proud of the history that was made yesterday. Across the country, citizens voted in large numbers. They showed a watching world the vitality of America's democracy and the strides we have made toward a more perfect union. They chose a president whose journey represents a triumph of the American story, a testament to hard work, optimism, and faith in the enduring promise of our nation. Many of our citizens thought they would never live to see that day. This moment is especially uplifting for a generation of Americans who witnessed the struggle for civil rights with their own eyes. And 4 decades later, see a dream fulfilled. A long campaign has now ended and we move forward as one nation. We're embarking on a period of change in Washington, yet there are some things that will not change. The United States government will stay vigilant in meeting its most important responsibility, protecting the American people. And the world can be certain this commitment will remain steadfast under our next Commander-in-Chief. There's important work to do in the months ahead, and I will continue to conduct the people's business as long as this office remains in my trust. During this time of transition, I will keep the President-elect fully informed on important decisions. And when the time comes on January the 20th, Laura and I will return home to Texas with treasured memories of our time here, with profound gratitude for the honor of serving this amazing country. It will be a stirring sight to watch President Obama, his wife Michelle, and their beautiful girls step through the doors of the White House. I know millions of Americans will be overcome with pride at this inspiring moment that so many have waited so long. I know Senator Obama's beloved mother and grandparents would have been thrilled to watch the child they raised ascend the steps of the Capitol and take his oath to uphold the Constitution the greatest nation on the face of the earth. Last night I extended an invitation to the President-elect and Mrs. Obama to come to the White House. And Laura and I are looking forward to welcoming them as soon as possible. Thank you very much.